Okay, so it is the last day I can work on the truck for right now. I'm actually getting on a plane tomorrow to fly back to Texas. So yesterday we got the coolant rail installed, we got the spark plugs in, we got the head on, we got the valve cover on. So that is all set. Today I need to tighten down this alternator, the bottom bolts and the top bolt. The exhaust manifold is not on yet. I need to clean up that exhaust pipe right there. I need to clean up the bottom of the manifold, and then today we need to put that all back together. This bracket goes right here, so I need to bolt that in, and then I need to reattach the carburetor, reattach the choke line, which is the one with the tape on it. I need to reattach all these air and fuel lines and whatever other lines. There's one that goes from the air pump, from the air compressor up to the thing there. I believe that's the low air pressure warning buzzer. This attaches to the manifold. This is the throttle linkage. It attaches to the carburetor. That cable, I'll put that out of the way. That cable is for the the deep water fording kit, which is not installed, so I don't need to worry about that cable. But the one with the blue tape is for the choke, so I need to reattach that. And then I need to reattach those 3 lines to the carburetor. And then we should be all set. So a lot of stuff to do, not a lot of time, so let's get to it. So while we were cleaning up the head and everything, we started looking at some of the hardware that we had. Now, some of it was perfectly good and we were able to reuse it without a problem. But some of the nuts and bolts and studs were too rusted to use, the threads were stripped, the head of the bolt was marred so that we couldn't reuse it, and some of them were just so coated in oil that even trying to clean them off with brake clean didn't work. So in the end we had to replace a bunch of hardware. Now this wasn't that big of a deal because with this stuff you can go to your local hardware store and you can just bring in the old bolts or get the replacements that are exactly the same, and it's all standard. Of course, our local hardware store does stock quite a bit of metric and standard, but they have a lot more stuff in standard size. And so because it's got standard sizes and the thread thicknesses are standardized, there's for every size bolt, there's a coarse thread and a fine thread. It just tells you how close together the threads are. So if this is a bolt, or in this case, let's say this is the exhaust manifold stud, coarse thread would be threads very far apart, and then fine thread would be threads very close together. So the only problem that we had when we were looking for hardware is that the exhaust manifold studs, they had fine thread on one end and coarse thread on the other. So they've screwed into the cylinder head with fine thread, and then they screwed into the nuts screwed onto them to hold the exhaust manifold in place with coarse thread. So this is a problem because trying to find studs that were long enough, because some of these studs were very long, that had fine thread on one side and coarse thread on another side, it just didn't seem like something that would be very easy to do. So what we did instead is we replaced the studs with bolts. So instead of having a stud that you put a nut on the end of, you would have a bolt, and these are theoretically supposed to be the same size. So you would have a bolt with fine thread that was long enough to go through the exhaust manifold. And so instead of having to screw in the stud into the cylinder head and then put the exhaust manifold on and then screw a nut onto the end of the stud, we just made it one bolt. And so that worked out well for us. And all of the other hardware we were able to find replacements for, because the fine thread versus the coarse thread, it's all standardized. So these were 5/16, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And then so for the coarse thread, it's a certain number of threads per inch. And then for the coarse thread, it's a certain number of threads per inch. And then for the fine thread, it's a certain number of threads per inch. And so as long as they are standardized, we could easily replace these parts that we needed to. The only other thing to keep in mind when replacing nuts and bolts, besides the size, which would be the diameter, and the threads, whether they are fine thread or coarse thread, and of course the length of the bolt, the only other thing you have to worry about is the grade of the hardware. So for standard hardware, standard nuts and bolts, there's grade 2, grade 5, and grade 8. And the higher the grade, the stronger the bolt is. So grade 8 hardware is much stronger than grade 5 hardware, and some applications specifically require grade 8 hardware. And then for metric, the grades are a little bit different, I believe, but no matter what, you choose the bolt based on the diameter, the threads, whether it's coarse thread or fine thread, the length. For bolts with nuts, it doesn't really matter, and then the grade. Is normally the hardware store has these little things that help you tell what size a nut or a bolt is and what kind of threads it has, and then I find the exact replacements, and so that just makes it easier when you have the physical nut or bolt, and you can compare it with all the other ones that are there to find the closest match.